We're in the book of Judges, and last week we covered chapter 3, and there were two judges in chapter 3. We really just scarcely touched upon the second judge, who was Shamgar, but Ehud was the primary judge that we looked at. And I'll pause for a second as I mention Ehud and say hello to Leslie. She doesn't have anything to do with Ehud, but she commented, "Hello, everyone on here." So there are these two judges, Ehud and Shamgar. Actually, there's three in chapter 3. Othniel's that first one, but Ehud takes up the majority of that chapter. So far, what do these judges in the book of Judges have in common with each other? Violence?
Unfaithfulness and stuff like that. Now the judge is trying to get the people back. That's what they're trying to do. But they're sort of failing at it.
Yeah, they really don't fail during their time, do they? But Bob says they're kind of failing at, and he's absolutely right in the sense that we do not have a perpetual, long-term turn back to God, do we? And so this is a problem. Now, we noted early on that the book of Judges has this spiraling trend of worse and worse behavior and worse judges or leaders, right? With that in mind, though, what is the primary problem causing the people to leave God?
In the land, and they intermarried with them, and they kept them for slaves, and then they started worshiping their gods.
Okay, boy, Sharon gives us a 15-second rundown and just hits all the high points all at once, right? Now, I would ask this question: what prevented the people, or what were they lacking to do all those things? This is the main thrust of the book of Judges. 2 weeks ago, or I guess I wasn't here 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I mentioned a verse right at the end of the book that highlights this. They didn't know God?
Something to those lines.
Yeah, that's early on at the end of chapter 2. We see a generation that races that doesn't know God. And I guess my question is, why didn't they know God?
People that was before them wasn't teaching them right, because they was all the time doing evil in the sight of God, and weren't teaching them right, and they were letting them marry out of their lineage, marrying daughters of other kings and stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
So that would distract them and get them not staying where they should be.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bob says they're not taught, and I would expand on that word taught a little bit to say not shown God, right? Because it's not just about intellectual information. Let me ask this way. I've got two questions for you, because the follow-up question is going to be, what's the difference between the period of Judges and the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, actually 2nd Samuel as well, and 1st and 2nd Kings, or you might say it's redundant, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So in other words, what's the difference between the time of the Judges and the time of the Kings? Now, as you think about question B, let's come back to question A. What causes them to go awry? When the people would go astray, what happened every time? We've already seen it 3 times in chapter 3.
It was all.
They were taken over. They were oppressed in some way or another by a foreign entity. And then they would cry out to God, and what did God send them?
First you sent them judges to...
Deliverance in the form of judges, right? And now, what were judges? What's another tag we could, even a broader tag we could give them? They were leaders. The difference between the book of Joshua and the book of Judges is leadership. And what we are seeing over and over again is when good, healthy leadership, and that's relative because the leadership gets worse and worse, right? But still, it was better than what they were without. They did well, right? And when there was no leader, when Ehud dies, look at verse 1 of chapter 4, if you would, please. And the people of Israel did again, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after what? Ehud died. So they were faithful while Ehud was alive. And what don't we have after Ehud's dead? Leadership. Any form of leadership. Until Deborah. Now, pause that thought for a second. And that pattern goes throughout the entire book. 15 times, right? It's the same story, different circumstances. What is the difference between, for the people of Israel, between the period of judges and the period of kings? Because remember, at the end of the book of Judges, that verse says, and there was no what? Very last verse, no king. Thank you, Tom. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What was the difference? Was there leadership under kings? Yeah, by definition, right? Go ahead. A lot of the kings or a lot of the judges? Yeah, yes, there's a connection there between the judges and prophets at times. In fact, almost all of them at some level, not entirely, some level, where we have a contrast between no leadership and bad leadership, right? Once the kingdom splits after the first three kings, after the third king, excuse me, the southern kingdom had this trend going on. Good king, bad king. Good king, bad king, roughly speaking. The northern kingdom had this trend going on. Bad king, worse king, worse king, worse king, really bad king, a little bit worse, a whole lot worse, not quite so bad, right? But they're all bad. Now, here's the point, and I want to look at a couple verses before we get into Deborah in chapter 4 tonight. Now, I'll tell you what spurred these verses in a moment. There are a lot of things that people in the church point to today about failings of the church, and they almost always have to do with outside the church. Everything I believe we see in the Bible points to the fact that we in the church have to do what we're supposed to do. In other words, the condition and current state of the church, wherever that is from, place to place or generally speaking, reflects leadership. And always will. To me, it's really, really important that we as churches don't gather to talk about how the world isn't measuring up, how society is just refusing God. The reason for that is it's direct parallel to the Israelites saying the Canaanites had giants with them. The Canaanites had iron chariots. The Ammonites had too many people, right? And God is constantly bringing this back to lay it at the feet of the Israelites. Now, I think at this point of the book, we have to take note of the contrast and the similarities of today. In other words, we're going to see this story replayed over and over again. There arises a leader. The people do well. They turn to God. There's a period of peace. The leader dies. No leader steps up after them. And then we go downhill, and then another leader comes back over and over and over again. Right? Now, there are, Linda's not here. I know she oftentimes likes to point out Romans 15:4. These things were written for our learning, right? Are there some things about the book of Judges that do not directly apply? Absolutely, right? Chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, Ehud shoved a dagger into a king's belly while he's giving him tribute or taxes, right? And kills them and then escapes. And then there's this big slaughter of people. Are we to be a militant church? Careful, that's a trick question. There's head shaking now, which is correct. But it was a trick question, wasn't it? We are a militant church, but not in a physical sense, right? And so those of you shaking your head no, you're absolutely right. What kind of warfare do we engage in? Spiritual, right? Now, the Old Testament, and there's lots of reasons we're not going to delve into today unless there's questions about the Old Testament, was physical representation of the spiritual kingdom that was going to come, right? So, and have there been people throughout the ages use the book of Judges and the book of Joshua to constitute genocide and war and all kinds of things like that? Absolutely. Absolutely. But let's come back to Ephesians, the 6th chapter, if you would, into the New Testament. And here's the parallel that Paul draws for us. And you're familiar, most of you, I'm certain, with this passage. Starting in verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God. How many of you saw Cam? Was that Sunday night or last Wednesday night when he came through with his armor? That was Sunday morning, wasn't it? Yeah, that was the same armor, the first lesson I ever gave on Wednesday night. I used that and dressed Chris with that armor from Ephesians 6th chapter. But the sword did not survive Sunday morning. 3 decades long, and it died Sunday morning. So the sword of the Spirit's, well, that one's not alive and quick and powerful. It died. But put on the whole armor of God. We're talking about militant, right? That you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against oops, I lost my place. Against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. We do not battle against flesh and blood. Does the book of Judges provide an example for us to get up, march, and to fight? Yeah. And what we're going to see Deborah say today is a number of things. Number one, she's going to say, did not the Lord tell you to go? And then she's going to say, get ready and go, because now is the time. Sorry about that. Now is the time to go. And then she's going to say, has the Lord not went before you? Now, all those things are spot on, applicable to us. But not in a physical sense. Did these judges have a military plan that they followed?
No, because the one here, Barak, said he wouldn't go unless Deborah went with him. And she said she would go with him. Otherwise, he wasn't going to go. He was afraid because of the chariots that Sisera supposedly had. And, but that was, instead of believing that God would take care of it, he was relying on Deborah to help and stuff. God would have took care of it for him, but he didn't believe it, so he wanted.
Right. So Barak was a general. He should have been a leader, right? And now we'll get into the details of that lesson in just a moment. The leaders aren't doing their job. The people are in oppression. People are wicked. Deborah steps up. Does she have a military plan? Absolutely she does. And that's what I referred to. It's in verse 14. We'll get there. She sees what Jabin the king does, and she says to Barak, now go. Now's the time. There was a plan. Right? Do we, generally speaking, don't answer this out loud, but you can answer to yourselves. Do we, generally speaking, have plans in our churches today? You cannot aim at what you, or you cannot hit what you do not aim, right? I listened to some of North Meadville's church evangelism's seminar this week, and I can't remember the name of the individual they had from house to house, heart to heart, but he classified it, he made that statement that I just made, and classified it this way, that most churches today are shooting from the hip with absolutely no plan.
With their intentions and stuff like that. I mean, they wanna do it, but they just don't do it for some reason.
And I'll bet if we tried to find it, Bob says they want to do it, they just don't do it. I'll bet you if we all wrote down it on a piece of paper, there's probably pushing 30 of us here tonight. So we'd have 42 different answers on what it is, right? That's not a plan, right? If these 10,000 soldiers are running in 40,000 different directions, that's not a plan. So he brought up a couple of these points I want to share with you so we can bring them back into Judges 4. Here's a big contrast as you turn your Bibles to, to Luke 2 and 52. Would you get me someplace? Thank you. Luke 2 and 52. Here's a big contrast between the church and the time of Judges. And it's missed more severely than sometimes I think we realize. Did the Israelite people need the Canaanites to like them? No. No. Do we as a church need people to like the church? Thank you much. Usually the answer is no, we should be hated. If we're not, we're just not doing our job. We need to be offensive. But you got a really good point. It's really hard to convince someone that they need to change their life and that I've got good advice for them when I've so offended them they can't hardly see straight. So, what about this? The church going to be hated? Absolutely. But I think there's even a misconception about Jesus. Who hated Jesus? Yeah, but it wasn't even all the Jews, was it? The multitudes loved him. It was just the religious people who hated him. Luke 2:52. Notice this about Jesus. Then we'll apply this to the church. Where did that verse go? I've done something wrong. Oh, that's what happened. Just because chapter 2 is on the same page doesn't mean you're in chapter 2. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in what? With who? God and man. Jesus increased in favor with God and man. If you would come back to Matthew 10 and 32. Matthew 10, 32. 10 and 16. 32 is a good verse too. Talks about confessing and not denying, but verse 16 will be more on spot. Now this is Jesus sending out limited number of his disciples to teach, and notice what he tells them. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Is wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Do you think Deborah told her soldiers to be as wise as serpents? Yeah, probably. As innocent or harmless as doves? Not a chance. Now, a word that we see used here in other applications is favor and grace, kindness, hospitality. There is a difference between the fighting soldiers of Judges and the church. And sometimes those lines get blurred and we think we're going to run out into the church, into the world and just slay all the demons. Right? It's just not the example that we see. What about the church? If you would go over to Acts 2 where it gets started, right? Acts 2 and 47. And this statement is used in an awful lot about the church that, as I said, this came up in the evangelism seminar in North Meadville over the past weekend. But I first became aware of it just about 6-7 years ago. Not very long, really. The statement is put a lot of the growth statements throughout the book of Acts. This is speaking, we're picking up in the middle of a sentence here. The people were praising God and having what? Favor with who? All people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. What was the predecessor to the Lord adding to the church? They had favor, right? We could just come right down through the next couple chapters. Next chapter 4:33. In great power, and with great power, the apostles were given their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great what? Grace was upon them all. We made subtly that connection between grace and favor a little bit ago. Go over one more chapter in chapter 5, if you would, please, in verse 42. And every day in the temple and from house to house they did not cease, teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. Now, you didn't see the word favor or grace there, did you? You know what they were doing, though? They were going to house to house. Now, sometimes in the past I've heard that related to as door knocking. That's not what these people were doing. They were eating with one another. They were spending time and getting to know one another, gaining favor. Last thought. We're not going to go necessarily to these verses. Two thoughts. When we talk about elders and we choose elders, what are elders in the church? What are they meant to be? Leaders. I was in a seminar one time for an eldership, and a gentleman made this statement that's really, really stuck with me. He said, the problem is when congregations are trying to find elders, is they're just picking men who they think meet the qualifications of elders, but are missing the underlying issue that these men are to be leaders. So if these men are not leaders before they're chosen to be elders, they're not going to be leaders once they're elders, and therefore they're missing a fundamental characteristic of the job. And so underlying characteristic that these individuals should be individuals doing the job before they're put into the office or position. When you look at the characteristics of elders, there's a lot of focus on a lot of those. But do you know what comes up in each one of the lists that are seldom talked about? Hospitality, favor, and kindness. People who are with people, gaining favor. Last little bit as far as it pertains to leaders in the church, and it pertains to the church being leaders. How many of you spend any substantial time? Don't raise your hand for this, please. But answer to yourself, how many of you spend any substantial time with sinners, with unbelievers? Any substantial time with sinners? All the time. You can't get away from them, right? But with unbelievers. Right. And a lot of times in the church, we say, oh, never. Not me, very little. Only when I have to. And we've created this situation where we think it's good to surround ourselves with people that think just like us, and look like us, and act like us. And it's interesting, in 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, and start in verse 10, there's that horrible situation of adultery within the own family. And Paul makes this statement. He says, I told you not to associate And he goes down through this list of characteristics. They aren't just sins. The fornicator, the liar, the greedy, right? They're character traits, not just sins. He says, but I'm not talking about outside the church, or you'd have to come outside the world. I'm talking about don't associate with a brother. You see what he's saying? Here's the point. How can we influence society? How can we impact people who don't know God if we don't spend time with them, if we don't garner their favor, and we don't gain their respect? That's the warfare that the New Testament Christian is to be engaged in. Sometimes Amanda and I have battles at our house. Not wars, just battles. And sometimes we talk about being militant Christian. That's what we think we're supposed to do with people who disagree with us. There's parallels, but there's significant contrasts as well to the book of Judges. Questions, comments, denials, rocks to throw. Uh-oh.
Illustration is Christ, the perfect example, gave up his body for the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So really his body, he didn't have a home, he didn't have a family, he didn't have a job. He gave up his only physical possession in this world with much pain. So, I mean, that's kind of a hard idea to grasp, but it's the only example we have is to give up our physical possessions, our bodies, our time, our generosity, our love, to present the truth.
Yeah. I've heard it referred to as a militant love, right? I think it's worth pointing out those contrasts for a couple of reasons. I think that helps make the book applicable, and I think it also helps us to understand how what took place during this period has influence or impact on us. Okay, so chapter 4 and chapter 5. You're wondering, wow, how are we going to get into this? We probably will cover most of this because what it is it's a story about Deborah in chapter 4 and her deliverance. In chapter 5, and this kind of fits into what we talked about on Sunday nights the last couple weeks, in chapter 5 is Deborah's song about what took place and what's taking place. And I want to highlight a couple pieces of the song because it'll help us frame what takes place. Verse 2, we'll start in this is chapter 5. Okay, so we're going to look at the song first, and then we're going to come back next week and look at the actual events. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day. So this is their victory song, right? The leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Now, if you're reading King James, that verse 2 is very different, the first phrase. And the reason for that is in some of the manuscripts, the meaning is very obscure. And more have leaned towards what I just read at this point. That the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly, bless the Lord. What's Deborah say happened? Leaders stepped up to the plate and the people offered themselves. But here's what's interesting. Deborah's not kind to everyone. What takes place, she talks about how God had delivered Israel in the past, and then she talks about what takes place more recently. In verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned, and the travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until, we're going to stop there. Did that 6 and the beginning of 7 sound good? You ever get into a part of a city where all the businesses are gone? There's not really anyone walking on the streets that you feel comfortable walking next to. And all the doors are locked. I know even down Johnstown, which isn't big, but I work in the Johnstown area some, and I've made a wrong turn time or two. And you can get in sections of Johnstown where all the windows have bars over them. And actually there was a business, a tire chain business right down in there. And I had to walk across the street, and I mean, you rang the bell and a little slot opens up. What you want? I mean, they're not cracking the door or anything. I told them I was there to pick up, and I heard a thud around the corner. The slat came back open. He says, it's on the back deck. He wasn't going to open that door for anything, right? And that's what Deborah is saying Israel's like. It's not a safe place to be. And then notice what she says. Until I arose, I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When the new gods were chosen, verse 8, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? It's a rhetorical question. She's saying you forsook the real God, and there was war in the gates, but there was no spear or sword to be seen. She says, until I arose. Right? She's saying no one's fighting to fix the problem, to defend it. And then she goes on. But 10 and 11 is interesting. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. The sound of musicians in watering places, there they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, the righteous triumphs of the villagers of Israel. Now I think there's two things going on here. Deborah is saying, man, these events were so great that even in high places, they're being told over and over again. But there's something else I think she's getting at here, and it comes out a little bit later. She's saying, what's she mean, those who ride on white donkeys and sit on rich carpets? Who she talking about? The wealthy. You think they were the ones in the trenches fighting? It's time of Judges, not World War I. They weren't in trenches. But, right? They weren't on the front lines fighting, right? No, and she says, you tell about it. You've benefited from it. The villagers are back. But then let's come forward to 15 and 16, because Deborah throws some pretty big punches here. Let me set stage, because Bob, you mentioned Barak. And Barak is from Zebulun, which is on the northern aspect of Israel. Deborah is just about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. We're going to see this, Lord willing, next week when we get into chapter 4. But people are coming from all over Israel to seek her out for her wise counsel and judgment. And she summons Barak from the north to come fight. It speaks of her influence, doesn't it? But not just Barak from Zebulun, but much of Israel comes. When she says fight, they fight. Wow. She's got influence. She's got power. She's a true leader, right? Did everyone come and fight? You might not know that. You haven't looked at it real closely. It's okay that you don't. That's our purpose of studying it this time, is so that you know that. No, they didn't come. Look what Deborah says. I'm going to start here in 14 because, again, we're in the middle of a sentence. Verse 14, from Ephraim, their route, they marched down into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen. From Machir, marched down, that's Manasseh, marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun, those who bear the lieutenant's staff. The princes, verse 15, of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar, faithful to Barak, into the valley rushed at his heels. So all these people, and the list started before I started reading here, have come and have heard the call to battle. Then look what she says. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of the heart. You ever been with someone when it's time to take action and they need to think about it a little bit longer? And then they need to think about it a little bit longer? Now, Kyle, we were in a situation about 3 years ago where there wasn't a whole lot of time to think about what needed to happen, right? Action needed to take place. Can you imagine sitting down on a stump and say, we want to make sure we do this right? Wouldn't be a good day, would it? Wasn't the best of days as is. There were great searchings of the heart. She's going to repeat herself here, verse 16. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks? What's she saying? What did Reuben say? I've got things I've got to take care of. She said, you sat with your sheep. Well, we were fighting a battle. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of heart. It seems to me she's saying they had to think about it, what they were going to do a bit longer. Verse 18, Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, why did you stay with your ships? The tribe of Dan, they had ships they had to take care of, boats. They couldn't leave them. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did you stay with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. Zebulun is a people who risk their lives to death. Naphtali, too, on the heights of the field. Who was delivered? Who was delivered?
Everyone.
Right? In this story, we're going to see a true leader. We're going to see a reluctant leader. We see the people who did what they were called to do by God, and those who didn't. That's the story of Deborah. Ladies, enjoy it. It's the best story in the book for you. Questions, comments? Thank you.